Well, all right. Last week and even the weeks before last, we looked at, we've been talking about Daniel's vision for a couple of weeks, and we looked at uh, this now, the second of these, and we've seen what I guess I would call a really strange cast of characters in this vision. We talked about a number of different characters last week, and then John a couple of weeks ago as well at the three beasts. But if you recall, the cast of characters that we've seen so far were the lion that the which represented the Babylonian or Neo-Babylonian Empire. We saw the bear, which was the Medo-Persian Empire, which could have been um, any one of a couple of kings we'll talk about in a moment. We saw the leopard, who was Greece. And we saw last week this unknown, this beast that was not like any animal that we know of, that had 10 horns, who was described as terrifying, dreadful, and exceedingly strong. And we know that beast represents the kingdom of the Roman kingdom, the Roman Empire. And we also know that that in the end times he represents the Antichrist, and we will talk about that much more in a few minutes. We saw this character that came up last week for the first time, the Ancient of Days, this eternal, all-wise, all-powerful, the one that ultimately killed the fourth beast and took away the dominion of the other three. And we know this Ancient of Days to be none other than God himself. And we saw this one name known as the Son of Man, given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. And it said all the people shall serve him. And that, of course, is Jesus' favorite term for himself in the New Testament. I believe I mentioned last week that he's referenced by himself and others 88 times in the New Testament as the Son of Man. But there's another big surprise toward the later on in these verses in 15 through 28. We're going to see another character introduced that's been left out of the vision so far, and we're going to talk about that extensively. But remember the outline of this basic outline of this chapter. The first, if I could talk, the first 14 verses are the dream. And the next 14 verses that we'll talk about tonight are the explanation or interpretation of that dream. Pardon me, one important detail was left out of this, has been left out to this point, and it dominates the explanation that we'll see later on. But right now, let me read the entire passage for us through, and then we'll go back and kind of dig into it verse by verse. And he says in verse 15 of chapter 7, as for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. I want you to remember Daniel's expression in verse 15 as we go on. We're gonna come to that again in a moment. Goes on to say, these four great beasts are four kings who arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war on the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So look at that. Daniel tells us here that the visions alarmed him. The visions made him anxious and alarmed in verse 15. And look what he said in the prior verse. I can't figure I go backwards. In the last verse, verse 28, he said, my thoughts greatly alarmed me and my color changed. So needless to say, because he had to repeat this, this was an incredibly nightmarish sort of vision that Daniel had here. This these verse 15 and verse 28 are, I would think, what you would characterize as what David refers to as an inclusio, that everything within in this passage between verses 15 and 28 explain why Daniel was so alarmed. And he'd seen a lot of terrifying things in this vision. There were probably a number of reasons for Daniel to be terrified. I think the beast, as I said, were things of nightmares. This isn't just a dream. This is kind of the worst kind of dream. And he said that he saw a lion that had eagle's wings and the mind of a man. He saw a bear that had bones in its teeth and was told to devour much flesh. He saw a leopard that had 4 wings and 4 heads, and he saw a 4th beast that was terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. You know, we talked last week about why Daniel used those 3 terms that mean almost the same thing, and it's for emphasis, to emphasize how terrifying this 4th beast was. And I gotta say, if I had seen this in a dream, I'd probably be a little bit anxious and alarmed too, or more than a little bit. But Daniel sees this one standing there, an unidentified observer, and he asks him what all these things mean. So who is this person that Daniel sees standing there? Clearly we know that Daniel didn't have the ability to interpret dreams and visions, at least without God's help. We know that he apparently recognized this figure. Apparently he at least recognized that this was someone sent from God to help him understand God's the revelation of this vision. And I have an inkling of who this might be. Obviously, he's not mentioned by name in this passage, but in other passages we know that Daniel was spoken to by the angel Gabriel in chapter 8. We'll study, I'm sure it's next week or the week after this passage. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Now, to be sure, this particular vision that Daniel's referencing in verse 8 is a different vision, but nonetheless, we see that Gabriel came to him to help him understand the vision. And in chapter 9, he said, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. So I can't say conclusively, but kind of to my way of thinking, I think there's good evidence to suggest at least that this figure, this person that Daniel saw standing here, was none other than the angel Gabriel. Because notice in our passage in Daniel 9, he says, whom I had seen in the vision at first. So whoever it was, the important thing that to keep in mind here is that it wasn't Daniel that was interpreting the vision. He was just an instrument in God's hands. I mean, we see this going all the way back to our study of chapter 2, where he said, Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery that the king has asked, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. So Daniel has always been quick to give God the credit. And even now, as he's looking for an interpretation for this vision, I think that Daniel, at the very least, knows that this is one sent from God. And we go on to see that there were four great beasts. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. So it's interesting, the angel identifies these four beasts as four kings. We're going to talk again, like we talked last week, about this idea of dual fulfillment of prophecy, the near term and the longer term. And, and again, to repeat at the risk of being too repetitive, I'm going to remind you that last week we saw those beasts identified with Nebuchadnezzar, with unnamed kings of the Medo-Persian Empire, and maybe Darius the Mede or Cyrus the Great of Persia, or both. We saw the leopard identified with Alexander the Great and the four generals who divided the Grecian Empire after his death. And that's mentioned when we see that this beast had four heads. And then again, unnamed kings of the Roman Empire, the 10 horns, that we'll hear more about the future fulfillment, though, of this fourth beast later on as we discuss this. But this divine figure, this Son of Man that we were introduced to in verse 13 last week, that receives God's everlasting kingdom, isn't alone. And here's the good news for us, for you and me. There's a people, this other character in this story, as we talked about all the characters in this story, this other character in this story are called the saints that reign with him and this is where the vision, I think, gets really personal for you and me today. It's not only does Daniel present God as the Most High, as the one with the wisdom and authority and power to judge the nations, and to give the eternal kingdom to the Son of Man, who we know as Jesus Christ, but we're involved. The saints are involved here. And you know what? The great news here is we're not just spectators in this play. We are recipients of the kingdom. It says the fourth beast was given the people of God. I'm sorry, the people of God, the church. We play. It's fascinating to see how the church plays such a significant part in the culmination of all of history. And it's just, sorry about that. And it says, we will possess the kingdom forever and ever and ever. And it's what a comfort and a hope we possess because of that. It's important to note here, to me, I think that the emphasis of this interpretation isn't as much on the enemies of God and their power and their brutality, but it's on the kingdom of God, its certainty and its permanence for all of the saints, for eternity. The emphasis here is really positive. If Daniel was shaken or alarmed by the darkness of his vision, I think this interpretation is a reminder that about the outcome of all of this, the coming of God's eternal kingdom. But it seems like maybe Daniel was like one of us. The vision's explanation still wasn't enough to satisfy Daniel. He wanted more detail. He wanted a more detailed explanation. He apparently asked for one, and he received it. And you notice that passing over the first three beasts, Daniel's question focuses on the fourth beast. He said, "Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things and that seemed greater than its companions." So this fourth beast was different from all the rest. It was described by Daniel as exceedingly terrifying, not just terrifying, but exceedingly terrifying, teeth of iron and claws of bronze. And it devoured and broke and stamped what was left with its feet. It was utterly destructive, and it was utterly prideful. And we know that it was greater than its companions. He says, "As I looked, this horn made war on the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came. And judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. The time came when the saints possessed the kingdom." So this fourth beast, the fourth beast was arrogant. With his arrogant mouth, was given dominion for a period of time. And that's a little hard for us to understand. He prevailed over the saints for a period of time. And we discussed earlier on this idea of the dual fulfillment of prophecy. And here, I think this fourth king, rather than a reference specifically to the Roman Empire of Jesus' time, is a reference, as we discussed last week, to the Antichrist, who will lead in a big persecution of the believers. We see that referenced a lot in Revelation, and we see it in Second Thessalonians. For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. We see the Antichrist identified by John in Revelation. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And in Revelation 13, it opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given over every tribe and people and language and nation. But notice that this conflict that's happening with the saints, it reaches a crescendo. It reaches a peak when the Ancient of Days comes to set things right, and the kingdom is given to the saints. So this interpretation we see, for whatever reason that perhaps only God knows, is not given in a sequence, because before the saints receive the kingdom, the angel tells Daniel that there's going to be much persecution and conflict. So he goes on in verse 23 to say, "He said, as for the fourth beast, there will be a fourth kingdom on the earth that will be different from all the other kingdoms. As we said, it shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for times, and half a time." So this final fourth kingdom, excuse me, I'm getting dry. This final fourth kingdom is going to be recognized by its differences, by being different from all the other kingdoms. Primarily, it's more fierce, it's more destructive than the other kingdoms. We saw earlier, it's going to devour the whole earth. It's going to trample it down. It's going to break it to pieces. I mean, again, is it any wonder that Daniel was alarmed when he had this vision? But, and out of this final apostate kingdom are going to come 11 kings, all of whom were evil in their own right. But the 11th was obviously the most evil. So who are these 10 kings? Everybody wants to know who are the 10 kings that will arise. What are their names? And I think that we're not given their names. We are left with a lot of historical records, but there's probably I read probably 15 different commentaries that have differing opinions on who these 10 kings are. So are they a future confederacy of 10 nations, as my MacArthur notes to my MacArthur Study Bible suggest? Are they 10? Is it 10 used as symbolically for completeness, as in the final fulfillment of all earthly kingdoms before the Antichrist? So perhaps not a literal 10. Or is it a combination of past and future kings? I honestly think it's hard to have a high degree of certainty, but the suggestion I find most plausible is this last one, that these kings, that these are perhaps kings that will come, and some already have even come over a very long period of time, and perhaps not simultaneously, except for the 3 that we know were plucked up. And so, Greg, where do you get this? Well, I base this on 1 John chapter 2. He says, "Children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour." So John says that not only is Antichrist, what I would characterize as capital A Antichrist, coming in the form of the 11th king of Daniel, but there will be many so-called little Antichrists, I guess, if you will, some of whom John says have already come. So whoever they are, they lead up to this 11th king, who we now know is the Antichrist, and the capital A Antichrist. And this 11th king is different from all the others, but not in a good way. Daniel says he's going to put down 3 of the lesser kings. He's going to wage war on believers everywhere. He's more arrogant, astonishingly arrogant, speaks words against the Most High. And he's going to seek to change the times and the law. The context here, when we talk about changing the times and the law, seems to suggest more of a religious connotation than a secular one. He's going to try to change the worship of God, of Yahweh, by, among other things, changing perhaps the religious calendar and religious laws. He wants to change the order that God has established. We saw the verse out of 2 Thessalonians that he will make himself out to be God. So while this 11th king is incredibly powerful, and he opposes and oppresses God's saints, this is the best news of all. He's not all powerful. Notice that he is allowed to wreak havoc for a period of time. The kingdoms and the believers are given into his hand, not taken by him. God says, or Daniel says in his vision, they shall be given into his hand, or the angel tells Daniel. Revelations 13:7 says it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and the authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. So he's allowed to wreak havoc for a specific period of time. He's allowed to wreak havoc for times, and half a time. So how long is this? How long are times, and half a time? Well, we think we know, and the most logical and consistent interpretation that I find, and the one that makes complete sense to me, is 3.5 year time period. In Revelation, we read, "I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And in Revelation 13, we read, the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. So if we do our math, we know that 42 months is 3.5 years. So what's the good news? 3.5 years is a long time, Greg. But you know what? As bad as this is, it's really important that you keep in mind a couple of things. The time is limited. The beast will run rampant for 3.5 years, but God has hemmed him in and given him a limited time. He hasn't taken anything, and all the authority that he has been granted, has been given to him, has been given into his hand. The angel tells Daniel. So we need to be comforted by those words, to know that that there is a definite limit, both in time and in authority for this beast that's going to come. So, like the end of a great, I'm not much of a classical music fan, but I know enough to know that at the end of a great musical score, where you hear the big bass drums start to pound and the cymbals start to crash, here's where the interpretation comes to a conclusion. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here is the end of the matter, Daniel said. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So, in the end, to Daniel's amazement, verse 27 says, the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given. Shall be given to who? Shall be given to us, to the church, to the people of the saints of the Most High. How can we not be amazed and in awe of God? God meant this to be an incredible comfort, a great comfort to the people of Israel and through Daniel when they were in exile in Babylon 2,500 years ago. And he means it to be a great comfort to us today. So despite our circumstances and regardless of appearances, we take comfort knowing that God's in control, and he's going to humble and he's going to destroy all human kingdoms precisely at the moment that he decides to do it. And he's going to give that everlasting kingdom to his son and to his people with him. This has been a very timely lesson. This glimpse of the end was meant to give hope to the Israelites, and it's meant to give hope to us in this time of chaos. I'm not a believer in serendipity or circumstance or happenstance or coincidence. I think it's an incredible thing that God brought us to these passages in Daniel at this time in our history. It's meant to give great hope in the midst of captivity, and it's meant to give great hope in the midst of a global pandemic. For some, this pandemic has been life-changing. It's been a major trial. It's been a life and death issue for some people, even some people that we know well. For others, at least to this point, it's been just an inconvenience, an irritation more than anything, but it's still a trial. And it's preparing us in some small way for what's yet to come. And it's preparing us for the one to look to, for the Ancient of Days. And it's preparing us for what to look for, perfect justice and every wrong to be righted, and for the eternal reign and rule of the Son of Man. I close in his commentary on Daniel. Ray Stedman concludes chapter 7 with a statement that I'm going to close with. And that statement asks a series of questions. And So I'm gonna read it, and I'm gonna ask you to ask yourself these questions, to ponder these questions, to consider, can you answer yes to all of these questions during this time? So Stedman says, our sovereign God is in control of history. And we have to remember that always, no matter where we are in what's going on in our own personal history, our sovereign God is in control. As we consider the part each of us plays in human history, we must ask, am I on the right side of history? Am I investing my life in the things that will last for all eternity? Am I using my influence to reach others for Jesus Christ? Am I redeeming the time that remains to me in these evil days? And am I allowing God to use me as his chosen instrument in this fallen and dying world? So with that, I want, take as powerful and scary as Daniel's dream was, we have to take great hope in knowing that it all comes to a conclusion when Jesus Christ returns and claims us and claims the kingdom of the world for himself and destroys the beast. So be comforted, folks. It all ends well for us.